Picture this, you're an archaeologist standing at the edge of a canyon in Colorado. The year is 1915. Before you, carved into the cliff face 700 feet above the canyon floor, is a city. Not ruins. A city. Perfectly preserved stone rooms, ceremonial chambers, painted walls, as if the inhabitants simply walked away yesterday. But they didn't leave yesterday. They left 600 years ago, in the year 1300. And now here's what makes your blood run cold. They left everything. Pottery still arranged on shelves. Tools lying where they were last used. Food storage rooms sealed shut. It's as if an entire civilization received a warning that gave them just hours to flee, and they never came back. The Anasazi, the ancient ones, built an empire in the harshest desert landscape imaginable. For over 1,000 years, they not only survived but thrived, creating architectural wonders that rival anything in medieval Europe. They were master astronomers, engineers, artists. They built roads that stretched hundreds of miles, cities that housed thousands. And then, within a single generation, they vanished. But here's what archaeologists discovered when they started excavating those final settlements. Evidence that suggests their last years weren't peaceful. Fortifications, defensive walls, structures built in increasingly dangerous locations, accessible only by rope ladders that could be pulled up at night. What were they defending against? What drove one of North America's greatest civilizations to abandon everything they had built? Tonight, we're going to walk through the final years of the Anasazi. And I need to warn you, the evidence we've uncovered is disturbing. Because the same forces that destroyed them are patterns we still see in our world today. Before we go further, I want you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button. Because what we're about to explore isn't just ancient history, it's a warning written in stone. The story begins around the year 400, in a region where 4 states now meet: Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah. Indigenous peoples who had been nomadic hunter-gatherers for thousands of years began to change their way of life. They learned agriculture from peoples to the south: corn, beans, squash, the 3 sisters that would sustain civilizations across the Americas. With reliable food, they could settle, build, create. By the year 700, they were constructing elaborate pit houses, circular homes dug into the earth with wooden roofs. They wove baskets so intricate, with patterns so complex, that they're considered art today. They created sandals from plant fibers, each pair unique, each one beautiful. But they were just getting started. By the year 900, everything changed. They began building above ground. Multi-story apartment complexes made of stone and adobe. By the year 1000, they were creating structures that would make modern engineering. Chaco Canyon. If you haven't heard of it, imagine this: a planned city in the desert built according to astronomical alignments. The great houses, massive stone structures, some 5 stories tall, containing hundreds of rooms. The largest wooden beams in these buildings came from forests 50 miles away. They were carried by hand, without wheels, without pack animals. The sophistication is staggering. These weren't primitive dwellings. These were engineered marvels. The walls were perfectly aligned to solar and lunar cycles. During the winter solstice, a shaft of light would illuminate specific ceremonial chambers. They built roads, straight as arrows for hundreds of miles, sometimes 30 feet wide, connecting distant communities in a network that suggests a unified culture, perhaps even a political state. At its height, around the year 1100, Chaco Canyon may have been home to as many as 5,000 people. In the surrounding region, perhaps 30,000 Anasazi lived in interconnected communities. They were artists. Their pottery featured geometric designs of breathtaking complexity, black on white patterns that still influence southwestern art today. They created rock art throughout the canyons, petroglyphs that recorded their cosmology, their stories, their understanding of the universe. This was a civilization that had mastered its environment. They built sophisticated irrigation systems, terraces that captured every drop of precious rainwater. Then, reservoirs. They understood water management at a level that modern engineers study and admire. And then, around the year 1200, something began to go wrong. The first sign was subtle. Tree ring analysis, the science that lets us read climate records preserved in ancient wood, shows that rainfall patterns started becoming erratic around the year 1150. Not terrible, just unpredictable. The Anasazi had weathered droughts before. Their agricultural systems were designed for uncertainty. You can see it in their architecture, the way they built their fields, the storage facilities that could hold years of grain reserves. But by 1250, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Archaeological evidence from this period shows something disturbing. They began abandoning the great ceremonial centers. Chaco Canyon, which had been the heart of their civilization for centuries, was gradually depopulated. Not destroyed, not conquered, simply left. Where were they going? The answer reveals their growing desperation. They moved to the cliff faces, to locations like Mesa Verde. Now, I want you to understand what this means. Imagine living in a comfortable apartment building with easy access to your fields, your water supply, your community spaces. Now imagine being forced to move your entire life to a location where you have to climb a 70-foot cliff face every single day, where bringing up water is an exhausting ordeal, where one slip means death. You don't make that choice unless you're terrified. The cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde are spectacular. They're the images you see in every documentary about the Anasazi. But they're also evidence of fear. These weren't aspirational homes. They were defensive positions. And we can prove it. In southeastern Utah, archaeologists found a settlement from this period that's only accessible by a dangerous route involving handholds carved into sheer rock, followed by a wooden ladder that would have been pulled up at night. Getting there requires climbing above a 100-foot drop. Women, children, elders, everyone in that community was making that perilous journey daily. The walls of the dwellings in these cliff locations were plastered and painted. They still made their homes beautiful, but the beauty couldn't hide the terror encoded in the architecture. Around the year 1275, everything accelerated. The Treering data shows that a drought began in 1276 that would last for 23 years. But this wasn't just any drought. This was the worst mega-drought in the region's history. Rivers that had flowed for centuries dried up. Springs failed. The sophisticated irrigation systems became useless when there was no water to irrigate with. Crop failures became the norm. In storage rooms from this period, archaeologists find evidence of their desperation. They were eating plants they had previously ignored, processing foods that required intensive labor to make barely edible. They were starving. And here's where the story becomes truly dark. In some settlements from this period, archaeologists have found evidence that challenges our romantic notions of ancient peoples living in harmony. Castle Rock Pueblo in Colorado was discovered with evidence of a massacre. The entire population, 41 people, apparently killed in a single violent event. Buildings burned. The settlement abandoned immediately after. At other sites, there's evidence of cannibalism. Now, I know that's controversial. The indigenous communities who are the descendants of the Anasazi reject the idea entirely, and we should respect that. But the physical evidence, human bones with cut marks, burned human remains, specific types of damage that indicate processing for consumption, it's there in the archaeological record. The debate isn't whether the evidence exists. It's about what it means. Was this ritual? Was it warfare? Was it starvation-induced desperation? We don't know. What we do know is that violence was increasing. By the 1280s, the Anasazi were building fortified villages on canyon rims. Sites like San Canyon Pueblo in Colorado show sophisticated defensive planning. 50 to 75 of these fortified villages appeared across the region. High walls surrounded springs, the most precious resource. Defensive positions. Watchtowers. One archaeologist described it as an arms race. As resources became scarce, communities had to defend what little they had. Trust broke down. Alliances failed. The social fabric that had held this civilization together for centuries was tearing apart. If you want to understand this period more deeply, I highly recommend Craig Child's book, House of Rain. He literally walked the migration routes the Anasazi would have taken, sleeping in the ruins, experiencing the landscape as they would have. It's an incredible journey that brings this distant tragedy viscerally close. You can find it linked in the description below, and supporting the channel through that link helps us create more deep investigations like this. By the year 1290, the pattern was clear. The Anasazi weren't going to survive in the Four Corners region. The environmental catastrophe was too severe. The social collapse too complete. But here's what makes their story unique. They didn't die out. They didn't vanish in the way that Hollywood likes to portray ancient civilizations mysteriously disappearing into the mist. They migrated. The evidence is written across the landscape, if you know how to read it. Trails of pottery shards leading south. Settlements along river valleys, showing the characteristic Anasazi construction techniques. Architecture that gradually transforms, incorporating new influences while maintaining core elements of the original culture. They were heading toward water, toward the Rio Grande, toward areas where life was still possible. But the journey must have been harrowing. Imagine being part of that exodus. You're leaving behind everything your family built for generations. The ceremonial centers where your grandparents prayed, the rock art that recorded your people's history, the elaborate stone cities that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge and effort. You're carrying what you can. Your children are hungry. The elderly struggle to keep pace. And you don't know if where you're going will accept you. Because the Anasazi weren't moving into empty land. They were moving into territories occupied by other peoples. Sometimes they were welcomed. Sometimes they weren't. The period between 1290 and 1300 represents the final gasp of the Anasazi in the Four Corners. Batatacan and Quetzal in Arizona, two of the most spectacular cliff dwellings ever built, were constructed in 1286. Think about that. They're building architectural masterpieces even as their civilization is collapsing. The last residents of these sites are dated to around 1295, and then they're gone. By 1300, the Four Corners region was essentially depopulated. A landscape that had supported tens of thousands of people for over 1,000 years was empty. The cliff dwellings stood abandoned. The great houses silent. The roads led nowhere. For the next several centuries, so what really happened? Why the complete abandonment? The scientific consensus now points to a perfect storm of intersecting catastrophes. The mega-drought was the trigger. It made the environment unable to support the population density the Anasazi had achieved. But drought alone doesn't explain the violence, the fear, the desperate defensive measures. What likely happened was a cascade of failures. The drought caused crop failures. Crop failures caused food shortages. Food shortages caused malnutrition and death, but also social stress. Communities that had cooperated for centuries began competing for dwindling resources. Trade networks broke down. Warfare erupted. As violence increased, people moved to defensive positions, the cliff dwellings, the fortified villages. But these locations were harder to farm from, harder to access water, harder to live in. So the crisis deepened. The social institutions that held the civilization together, the religious centers, the trade networks, the shared cultural practices, they all began to fail. When people are starving, when their children are dying, faith in the old ways erodes. Some archaeologists point to evidence of a religious transformation during this period. The kivas, the circular ceremonial chambers that were central to Anasazi spiritual life, show signs of being repurposed or abandoned. Perhaps there was a spiritual crisis alongside the environmental one. Perhaps the old gods weren't answering prayers anymore. The decision to leave wouldn't have been made lightly. But at some point, enough people must have concluded that staying meant death, and migration offered at least a chance at life. Here's what's haunting about the archaeological sites from this final period. They're neat, organized, not the chaos of a sudden disaster or violent conquest. More like people carefully closing up their homes, perhaps hoping to return someday. They never did. If this story is resonating with you, hit that like button. These deep investigations take weeks of research, and your engagement helps us continue exploring history's most compelling mysteries. So where did they go? The Anasazi didn't disappear into myth. They transformed into the Pueblo peoples who live in the Southwest today. The Hopi, Zuni, Ekama, and other Pueblo tribes all have oral traditions that describe their ancestors' migration from the north. These aren't vague legends. They're detailed accounts of specific clans traveling from specific locations, facing specific hardships, and eventually settling in their current homelands. Linguistic analysis supports this. Pottery traditions support this. Architectural techniques support this. The Anasazi became the Pueblo peoples, carrying with them the cultural knowledge of their ancestors while adapting to new circumstances. But something was lost in that transformation. The scale of architecture shrank. The great ceremonial centers were never rebuilt. The regional integration that had characterized Chaco Canyon's heyday That network of roads connecting communities across hundreds of miles, it fragmented into smaller, more independent communities. Perhaps that was a lesson learned. Perhaps the Anasazi civilization's collapse taught their descendants that massive centralization was dangerous, that putting too many people in one place, dependent on fragile environmental conditions, was a mistake. The Pueblo peoples who survived developed a different approach. Smaller communities, greater mobility, deeper integration with neighboring peoples. They maintained their cultural identity, their languages, their spiritual practices, their artistic traditions, but they adapted the social structure. And they survived the next great catastrophe, the Spanish conquest. While the Spanish destroyed many indigenous civilizations in the Americas, the Pueblo peoples persisted. They revolted in 1680, successfully driving the Spanish out for 12 years, one of the few successful indigenous uprisings against European colonization. Today, Pueblo communities still practice traditions that stretch back to the Anasazi, still perform dances that have been passed down for centuries, still speak languages that predate the cliff dwellings. So in a real sense, the Anasazi never vanished. They changed. They adapted. They survived. But the cliff cities remain empty, monuments to a civilization at its peak, and testimony to how quickly that peak can crumble. What can we learn from this? The pattern is uncomfortably familiar. Environmental stress, check. Resource depletion, check. Social fragmentation, check. Increasing violence, check. Mass migration, check. The Anasazi lived through a climate catastrophe they couldn't control. They responded with everything they had: technological innovation, social organization, defensive measures. But ultimately, the environment changed too much too fast, and their civilization couldn't adapt quickly enough. We're living through our own period of rapid climate change right now. Rising temperatures, changing rainfall patterns, drought and flood, agricultural stress, resource competition, mass migration. The Anasazi left us a case study in how civilizations respond to environmental catastrophe. Some of their responses worked. The migration saved many lives. Some made things worse. The violence and fragmentation accelerated the collapse. Their story isn't just archaeological curiosity. It's a warning carved in stone across the canyons of the Southwest. It's evidence that even sophisticated civilizations with centuries of accumulated knowledge can fail when the environment turns against them. But it's also evidence that people survive. Cultures adapt. Knowledge persists. The Pueblo peoples today are living proof that cultural death isn't inevitable. What matters is the knowledge you preserve, the adaptability you maintain, and the communities you build. Standing in those cliff dwellings today, and you can visit them. Mesa Verde is a national park. You feel the weight of all that history. The empty rooms. The ceremonial chambers where prayers were once offered. The living spaces where families laughed and fought and raised their children. You can still see the painted walls. Still see where they plastered the stone to make it smooth. Still see the air conditioning cracks they designed into the buildings to regulate temperature. The sophistication is humbling. And you realize these weren't primitive people overwhelmed by nature. These were engineers, artists, astronomers, farmers who understood their environment deeply. They survived in an unforgiving desert for over 1,000 years. They didn't fail because they were stupid or backward. They failed because they faced a catastrophe that overwhelmed even their sophisticated adaptations. And they didn't truly fail, because their descendants are still here. The mystery isn't really what happened to the Anasazi. We know what happened. Drought, social collapse, migration. The mystery is, what will we do differently? We have their example before us. We have the evidence of what happens when civilizations ignore environmental warnings until it's too late. The Anasazi left us more than ruins. They left us a lesson written across the landscape. The question is, are we paying attention? If this investigation moved you, share it. Stories like these need to be told. And if you want to go deeper into this mystery, check out the books I've linked in the description. Understanding the past isn't just academic, it's survival. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next investigation.